In Chapter 2 of her book, Addiction by Design, Natasha Dow-Schull details how player-centric design is used to create slot machines that maximize time on device. The idea here is that when slot machines emphasize player comfort and control, players spend more time gambling, increasing profits for casino owners. In one interview, a gambling machine designer says, "It's basically a matter of getting players into the seat and keeping them there. I'm trying to make the customer feel comfortable, feel in that cocoon." And in another interview, a casino owner says, "You want a situation where the customer can get anything they want when they sit down at your machine." But why is it important that a player feels in control while gambling? Isn't gambling all about chance? This originally struck me as paradoxical, but from the standpoint of the casino owner, it makes perfect sense. As soon as the player starts to feel that the game is unfair or that they're being cheated, they want to quit and stop playing. For the casino owner, this of course means less money. Giving players the illusion of control keeps them playing longer, which means more money for the casino. But a player's desire for control extends beyond gambling games. Role-playing games are usually advertised as being customizable, with an emphasis on player autonomy, character creation and development, and upward mobility through the in-world economic system. The Harvest Moon series, for example, centers around achieving financial and romantic success as players grow their farm's revenue and romance non-player characters. Consulting walkthroughs and guides for how to romance characters is a commonly accepted strategy within the fan community and is rarely considered cheating. As Mia Consalvo points out, many players don't even believe it's possible to cheat at single-player RPGs. These players assert that cheating as an issue only comes into existence when other players are present. Many role-playing game publishers even sold guides as merchandise up until the late 2000s when free, fan-made walkthroughs became widely available on sites like GameFAQs.com. Designers expect and allow this form of cheating because they know that a sense of lost control among players struggling with part of their game will result in players giving up and dropping the game. The dynamics surrounding cheating and control in gaming are complex. In making games that are addictive and yield the most productivity, designers should give players the illusion of complete control. Players should be somewhat easily able to achieve success as defined by the game's objectives, and so walkthroughs and guides naturally follow to ensure any player can get their desired result from a game through cheating. But there are also games that take the opposite stance on design. Games like Dark Souls, Pathologic, and Lisa are well known for being antagonistic towards their players. Their unfair mechanics and steep learning curve have become a marketing point in themselves. Discourse around fairness and ease in gaming online tends to exist within a culture of bragging as well. For example, From Software games' most devoted customer base likes them because they make hard games. The antagonistic, player-unfriendly design is appreciated and is usually contrasted against the more indulgent, fantasy-fulfilling design of RPGs. But I like to think that there's also an area between the player-centric and player-antagonistic design paradigms. Let's call this player-agnostic design. And let's make our example Studio Zaum's 2019 role-playing game, Disco Elysium. If most RPGs are player-centric and aim to make the player as comfortable and in control as possible, and on the other hand, masochore games like Dark Souls are player antagonistic and aim to present the player with a frustrating, insurmountable challenge to overcome, Disco Elysium is player agnostic. You can succeed or fail, but the story goes on either way, and the game will often put you in positions where you are up against the random number generator skill check mechanic. In Disco Elysium, you're not in control, you're just along for the ride, and there's no reward for playing the right way, or even a method for doing so. I decided to do my player's story about Disco Elysium because I think it resists the type of cheating that are so commonplace in RPGs. Not through making it mechanically difficult to save scum, but by making failure just as narratively interesting as success. My method is this. I'm going to try to fail every single important skill check in the game and solve the case as poorly as possible to see what happens. In a regular RPG, this would result in a game over, and I'd be forced to adapt my playing style in order to win. This is because RPGs position you as the hero of the world, and so the direction of the story tends to hinge on your success. There's really no other option for you than to win, because the game is designed in a way so that you are the most important aspect of the story. In Disco Elysium, there isn't really an option to win. You simply make your choices and the world moves on around you. Your uselessness and ineptitude are constantly highlighted, and because the game runs on a dice roll RNG skill check system, your failures are usually completely random and left up to chance. But this doesn't mean that failure is bad in Disco Elysium. Actually, you can have a very rewarding play experience even if you mess up at every important plot point. This is what I'm aiming to show you in this video. Now, let's get into my playthrough. So the basic story goes like this. You wake up, naked and hungover, on the floor of your hostel room with no memory of who you are or what you're doing there. You are an amnesiac detective responsible for solving a murder case, and there's a detective from another precinct here to accompany you. The setting is Revachol, a seaside town still recovering from a failed communist revolution 50 years ago. The town is under the control of the dockworkers union, who are currently on strike, and there's a negotiator from the Wild Pines group, the shipping company who the union works for, in town trying to make a deal and end the strike. Tensions have grown to new heights after one of the Wild Pines group's mercenaries was murdered and strung up in a tree behind your hostel. It's your job to find the murderer, and you only have a few days to get to the bottom of it, because the other Wild Pines mercenaries are planning to host a tribunal to decide the fate of the Union, who they suspect to be behind the killing. If you can't come up with a convincing case to convict one of your suspects, the Union and the mercenaries will go to war. If Disco Elysium was a typical detective story, you might find clues, chase leads, interview witnesses, and narrow down your list of suspects using conventional means. And you can do this, but solving the murder actually isn't central to the experience of the game, and the plot drives forwards regardless of how hard you try to get to the bottom of the case. You can spend the entire game doing nothing but sitting on benches and reading books, and the tribunal will still happen. My goal for this playthrough was to solve the case, but do everything wrong in the process, and see what the resulting story was. So, I drank, I did drugs, I took bribes, I played both sides of the political war for my benefit, and spent most of my time generally embarrassing my partner, Kim.
You need to get your shit together.
Most of this video is going to focus on Kim, because paradoxically, in my efforts to be a horrible cop, I ended up getting closer to Kim. Because I wanted this playthrough to go horribly, I knew I would have to be strategic about what stats I leveled up, so I consulted Reddit. The general consensus was that the best stats to put points into if you wanted to play an upstanding cop who solves the case correctly were volition, rhetoric, authority, and pain threshold. Basically, this would ensure you didn't have panic attacks every 5 minutes, that you could interrogate witnesses effectively, and you wouldn't die from stupid things like sitting in an uncomfortable chair, like I did. Naturally, I decided to keep these stats as low as possible, and instead invested in the skills everyone agreed were useless for solving the case. First and foremost, the Inland Empire skill. This skill is basically your level of imagination and psychic ability. It also makes you incredibly unstable and say things that don't make any sense. After that, shivers. This skill still confuses me, but basically it allows you to hear the city talking to you personified by a voice in your head.
Death. It is terrifying. I need you to protect me from death.
Third, Esprit de Corps, which grants you a level of telepathy. I often used it to hear what Kim was thinking throughout the course of our investigation. I came to refer to this build as the Twin Peaks build, because it meant that rather than being a detective who uses facts, logic, evidence, and gunpowder, I was solving the case pretty much entirely through visions, dreams, and psychic abilities. This build had the intended effect of making me a useless police officer, and I failed nearly every check on the first try. Now, let's talk about how the skill checks work. So, there's white checks and red checks. White checks can be retried, and red checks cannot. Your probability of passing the check is based on how high you've leveled that particular stat. If you've put nothing into authority, it stands to reason that you'll fail pretty much every authority stat. Because there are basically no uses for skills like hearing the city talking to you or having visions throughout the course of the murder investigation, this build had the intended effect of making me a useless police officer. I failed nearly every check on the first try. I also gave in completely to my electrochemical urges and started buying loads of drugs and alcohol. My investigation was going horribly. I was showing up to crime scenes simultaneously drunk and high on speed, and whenever I opened my mouth to talk to suspects and witnesses, my words made no sense to them.
The fuck is he saying? Some insane shit.
Then on day 2, I started receiving visions of the apocalypse.
A countdown has begun. All will collapse on itself. The world will disappear into a single grain of blackness. All sound will be muted. All life will scream.
But more on that later. On top of all of this, I was completely broke. I resorted to begging random people for money, taking bribes, and collecting bottles to exchange for money at the recycling depot. One night, I failed to pay my lodging fees on time, and I was forced to sleep in a trash bin. Throughout all of this, Kim was basically just embarrassed of me.
Please, detective, not this again.
But around day 3, something seemed to change in his demeanor. Instead of telling me off or trying to distance himself from my shenanigans, now he was actually beginning to humor me. Like I said earlier, I went fully corrupt right from the start of the game. I had aligned myself with both the Union and the Wild Pines Company, and was doing paid work for both under the table. I investigated a drug trafficking operation in town for Joyce Messier, the Wild Pines representative, and I agreed to help Everard Clare, the Union leader, get signatures from residents to build a new youth center and housing complex atop one of the crumbling and impoverished districts of town. This second mission didn't sit well with me morally. By this point, I had aligned myself with communism, because I figured this was the most ironic choice since, as a police officer, I was pretty much the enemy of every other communist in the game, and whenever I tried to appeal to them, they brutally shut me down. But my communist sympathies led me to scrutinize Claire's desire to gentrify the poorest residential area. And when I brought it up with Kim, he suggested we go even more corrupt and forge the signatures incorrectly so the proposal wouldn't go through.
It's not the sort of act I would normally encourage, but under the circumstances, if done discreetly, it may be the only way to save what's left of the village.
After this, Kim seemed way more willing to go along with my complete disregard for the murder investigation. We spent our time ghost hunting, playing board games, hanging out, and doing whatever this is. We also discovered a rundown church where I had an existential crisis, and then we later turned it into a nightclub. After a lot of convincing, I even got Kim to dance with me. I did some truly horrible singing during karaoke night.
I would often go there,
which Kim defended.
Let's go, officer. These people wouldn't know a good performance if it beat them in the ass.
And then we investigated a phenomenon known as the Pale, and found an anomaly in the church that allowed us to hear the Pale moving, but more on that topic later. In short, we did nothing useful in terms of police work. I even started sneaking out after Kim went to bed at night to do drugs with Kuno, the 12-year-old sleeping outside of my hostel. When we eventually got back to the murder investigation, we had wasted so much time and made so little progress that neither of us could seem to figure out what was going on. On top of that, everyone in town rejected our authority and refused to work with us due to their hatred for the police. The general consensus was that the Union had killed the mercenary, but we had no proof, and to make things worse, the one witness we had to the murder, Claudia, purposefully lied to and misled us. The murder was impossible to solve. Our breakthrough came when the Union finally admitted they hadn't committed the murder. When they'd strung the mercenary up into the tree, he'd already been dead. A friend of Claudia, a drug trafficker named Ruby, was seemingly to blame. We tracked down her hiding spot, way out in an abandoned area of town, and attempted to break in. It's worth mentioning that the skill check required to break into Ruby's hiding spot is the only skill check in the game that must be passed in order to progress with the story. I don't think this is meant to work as a skill barrier, but rather because finding and confronting Ruby triggers the endgame sequence, it's sort of the developer's way of encouraging you to go and do everything else you can before entering the climax of the narrative. So I had no choice but to pass the check. Finally, we had our suspect cornered. After a brief interrogation, during which she incapacitated us through the use of a noise machine, I realized she wasn't the murderer, although she was a criminal. Instead, she had only helped Claudia cover up the death, and then she, along with the rest of the Union boys, strung the body up in the tree behind the hostel. Knowing she would be arrested, Ruby turned her gun on herself. I tried to stop her, but I failed, and she committed suicide. At this point, Kim and I realized we had been played by Claudia, and that our efforts to solve one death had only resulted in another. We were no closer to finding the murderer than before. We returned to the hostel with the goal of arresting Claudia, but she had fled the scene. We had failed to find the murderer or make a single arrest. Completely distrustful at this point of our ability to do basic police work, the company mercenaries took things into their own hands and started the tribunal.
Crisis, death. You can feel it in your blue soul. Be prepared. Make sure you have your pepper box in your hand.
The tribunal is the climax of the game, and it is so extremely stressful. It's basically like a court trial scene, except nobody believes what anyone else is saying, and they're all pointing loaded guns at each other. Depending on what you say and your ability to de-escalate the situation, the tribunal can end with a few casualties or in a massive war. In my case, it went horribly because I failed literally every single check. We get into a shootout and everyone involved, save for 2 Union members, dies. I get shot twice and go down. Kim is leaning over me, trying to keep me from dying, but he's too distracted to notice one of the mercenaries is aiming to shoot him in the head. I have one chance to save him, and it's locked behind an authority check. In my opinion, this is by far the most stressful check in the game. I failed this check before in previous playthroughs, despite having a far more balanced build, so I knew it meant losing my partner and finishing the game alone. I had put no points into my authority stat because I had deemed it too useful for policing, so I was sure that when I rolled my cursor over it, the odds would be impossible. But they weren't. Even though I had spent most of the game messing around and completely destroying any chance of solving the case, in doing so, Kim and I had grown really close. My authority stat didn't matter, because he trusted me enough to do what I said. Despite the fact that I had failed in almost every other aspect, Kim and I were going to live. But that's not what this playthrough was about. I was trying to fail all of the checks. I had to let Kim get shot to go through with my goal. This was the whole point of my player story. So I reloaded and reloaded and reloaded, and after 14 tries, I finally managed to fail the check. Kim gets shot, and the screen fades to black. In previous playthroughs, when I've lost Kim, I was on my own for the ending of the game. But this time, something different happened. Something horrible. Because I had done speed with Kuno behind Kim's back earlier, Kuno now liked me enough to join my party and become my new companion. I finished up the game with him, arresting the murderer and rejoining my police force. But it didn't feel right. This was the only time in the game where I actually felt like I was cheating. The buffs I had been given on that fatal authority check were supposed to ensure Kim lived, and I had cheated by letting him die. Isn't that so backwards? Why would anyone want to save scum so that their partner dies? I knew this was the point of my player story, but I didn't want it to end here. And in a weird way, I sort of felt like the buffs that the game had given me to ensure that Kim stayed alive meant something. I felt like there was more to the story because it was so clear that the game didn't want him to die in this sequence, despite my authority stat being so low. So I did one final save scum, and I went back for Kim. With the one bullet in my gun, Kim turned and shot the mercenary in the head, saving us both. I passed out from blood loss, and the screen went black. I'm going to tell you about the ending of my Disco Elysium playthrough through the lens of my run with Kim, both because it was far more interesting, and because it actually worked really well thematically with my player story. So I woke up 2 days later in my room at the hostel. Total chaos had erupted following the tribunal, and the government was called in to observe from airships above the city, in case a revolution broke out. Kim had stitched my wounds up, but I was limping and my gun was out of ammo. Surmising that the murderer must have been a complete outsider, somebody we hadn't met yet and who hadn't been at the tribunal, we followed a set of clues we had previously looked over, and discovered that the killer was hiding out in an island across the peninsula. Boombox blasting, we headed north. My stitches had ripped, I was bleeding, and I looked close to death. Kim made me sleep before we continued on, and I had a dream where I could walk on water, through time, back to the past. I relived the moment where my ex-wife left me, the event that sparked my self-destructive spiral. When I awoke, Kim was still there with me, and together we tracked down and confronted the murderer. He ended up being an old man, a soldier left over from the failed communist revolution 50 years ago. He had killed that mercenary to keep the class war alive. He had no will to fight us, and once we presented all of our evidence, he gave himself up to be arrested. So far, this was exactly what had happened when I'd done this with Kuno. But then, something stepped out of the reeds and moved towards us. Kim could see it too. It was the cryptid we had spent so many wasted hours searching for at the beginning of the game, and it began to talk to me.
No, you are. The moral of our encounter is, I am a relatively medium life form, while it is you who are a total extreme madness. A volatile simian nerve system ominously new to the planet. The Pale too came with you. No one remembers it before you. The Nidarians do not. The radially symmetrics do not. There is an almost unanimous agreement between the birds and the plants that you are going to destroy us all.
Wait, the world is ending? For real? This sounds familiar.
A countdown has begun. All will collapse on itself. The world will disappear into a single grain of blackness. All sound will be muted. All life will scream.
So in the end, my psychic build had caused me to accurately predict the apocalypse, and I didn't even know that's what was happening at the time. The apocalypse, it seemed, was coming in 3 different ways. First was my personal apocalypse, aptly named Tequila Sunset.
Do you want to know how Tequila Sunset came to be?
Tequila sunset. Something ominous there.
Word on the street is you went around the local hostel telling people that you're a police officer, and that it would be really fucked up if you shot yourself in the head right in front of them. That's pretty high concept if you ask me.
This was essentially my own suicide. I was going to drink myself to death. The Tequila Sunset was my own demise at the hands of my alcoholism. Second was the tribunal and the subsequent shootout. After I had failed to save pretty much everyone, chaos broke out in Revachol. The Union versus the Wild Pines group, and government airships descended on the area. The blood that I had predicted would fill the streets was the blood of Union members and mercenaries fighting it out. 2 outsider cops had come into town to solve a murder and failed, and war resulted. As I came to realize, my entire purpose of keeping the peace was bound to fail, considering I was an unwanted force impeding upon an ideological war I didn't understand. I had convinced myself I was there to fight for justice, but all I did was make things worse. The third apocalypse is the Pale. Now, the Pale is one of the most mysterious aspects of this game, and the psychic build I had crafted for myself had me referencing it a lot, even though I didn't actually really know what it was until the very end of the game. I could hear the Pale in the church, but it's impossible to see or touch. It is nothingness, and it is slowly swallowing the world. According to the Phasmid, it exists because of humans. It is the entirety of human history, degrading memories into itself. It's the sum of all human failures manifested, slowly taking over the world, annihilating matter, and swallowing everything inside it. My visions of the apocalypse suddenly made thematic sense. I was obsessed with my own failures. My failure to get sober, my failure to stop my wife from leaving me, my failure to stop the tribunal, and the failures of mankind itself were weighing on me. And the Pale existed to vindicate these fears. There was an invisible force out there, caused by humans, that was ending the world. My feelings of doom were suddenly far less personal. Everyone in this game is obsessed with failure and the past. It's a central theme. Harry's inability to deal with his ex-wife leaving him causes him so much pain that he blacks out in a self-destructive, suicidal bender. His amnesia is a coping mechanism for this pain, just as much as the drinking was. The people of Revachol, too, are haunted by their failed revolution 50 years ago, which destroyed their city both physically and mentally. And then there was the murder itself, the thing that started the game, carried out by an old communist soldier who refused to believe that the revolution had failed, and continued fighting the fight. Everything that had happened so far was about failure. Kim snapped a picture of the cryptid to prove its existence, and then it disappeared. We headed back to the mainland to radio in the news of our arrest, and when we arrived at shore, my precinct was there waiting for me. By now, they'd heard of my failure at the tribunal, as well as my amnesia, and were looking for any reason to fire me. They asked Kim what he thought of me after spending the past week together, and Kim responded with this.
Well, the drinking, the lost gun, also losing his badge, that's all true. And he's been drinking on the job.
The man sighs deeply.
Then there's the apocalypse thing. At first I thought it was a joke, but it's not. He actually thinks the world is about to end, in a bloodletting or gloaming. We're about to become vapor, even. It's worrying, especially considering his political views. Detective Dubois is, as you may know, a Mazovian socio-economist. He wants to liquidate the ruling class, which, again, for a police officer, is a little odd. And then there's the motor carriage in the sea, and the drugs, of course. Amphetamine, mostly. But despite all this, he is a great detective. One of the best I have seen, in fact.
With the way I had played this game, I made pretty much everyone hate me. I was horrible at my job, I spent every day chasing leads completely unrelated to the case, I took drugs with 12-year-olds, I slept in the trash, I horrified everyone with my karaoke, and I failed to solve the murder until it was already too late. Despite that, though, Kim was always by my side. He defended me until the very end, in a way that he never had in my previous playthroughs. Kim mattered enough to me that I broke my own rules and sabotaged the goal of my playthrough just so I could finish the game with him as my partner, and it was totally worth it. I had approached this player story with the goal of showing that Disco Elysium takes a player-agnostic stance towards its narrative design. The game resists the typical RPG format of positioning the player as a hero, and does not allow you to customize your character or be successful or well-liked. Instead of pushing you to win, the game rewards failure by putting just as much thought and care into what happens if you make the wrong choices or lose a skill check as it does for if you win. I think I effectively proved all of this. But in doing this project, I also learned for myself just how much this game is about failure. The idea that you could win anything in this world seems almost silly, given the game's gloomy atmosphere and the prevailing sense that everything is corrupt and anything good exists now only in the past. However, through my constant failures, I actually grew extremely attached to the game, and especially to Kim. Those buffs I received during that authority check in the tribunal felt like an actual miracle as I was playing. So, although I do think Disco Elysium differs from most RPGs through its attitude toward failure, after this playthrough, I can honestly say that failing is the best part of this game. There wasn't a single moment I regretted or wished I could go back and change.
Every school of thought and government has failed in the city, but I love it nonetheless. It belongs to me as much as it belongs to you.